The year 1815 dawned on a continent of scars. Europe lay prostrate, a patient gasping in the wake of a quarter-century fever. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Russian steppes, the land bore the brutal signature of Napoleon Bonaparte's ambition, now finally, definitively, broken at a Belgian crossroads called Waterloo. But victory brought no jubilation, only a profound and universal exhaustion. This was the silence after the cannon's roar, a heavy quiet thick with the dust of shattered cities and the ghosts of 3 million dead. In the capitals, monarchs stared from palace windows not with triumph, but with a cold, creeping dread. The revolutionary specter, though momentarily caged, had not been exorcised. The ideas of liberty and nationalism, unleashed by France, still smoldered in the ashes of the old order. The Corsicans' defeat had not solved the crisis. It had created a terrifying vacuum. The map of Europe was a palimpsest of erased kingdoms and dissolved alliances. Geopolitical void that threatened to suck the continent back into the abyss. The physical devastation was a panorama of despair. Farmlands were trampled into mud by countless armies, their harvests stolen or burned. Economies, strained to breaking by endless war, groaned under mountainous debts. In the cities, hollow-eyed citizens navigated streets still littered with rubble, the grand avenues of empire now testament to its catastrophic cost. The very fabric of society seemed frayed, the old certainties of throne and altar shaken by the seismic events of the past decades. This pervasive chaos presented not just a problem, but an urgent imperative. The alternative to deliberate action was an unthinkable descent into renewed, perpetual conflict. The powers of Europe, victors and vanquished alike, faced a singular, monumental task. They had to invent peace. Not merely a ceasefire, but a new system, a durable architecture of stability to contain the forces of chaos. The stage was set not for warriors, but for diplomats. The battlefield would now be a drawing room, the weapons, parchment, and protocol. The great project of reconstruction was about to begin, born from the universal recognition that without order there could be nothing. Vienna in the autumn of 1814 was a city of exquisite paradox. While Europe's countryside still bore the raw wounds of war, the Austrian capital shimmered with a deliberate, dazzling opulence. Emperor Francis I had thrown open his palaces, and the city became a gilded cage for kings, a stage set of stability where the future of a continent would be negotiated. The Congress, it was said, did not deliberate, it danced, and at the center of the whirl, orchestrating every minuet and intrigue, was Austria's foreign minister, Klemens von Metternich. Metternich moved through the endless rounds of balls, banquets, and hunting parties with the serene air of a master puppeteer. His salons in the chancellery were the true engine rooms of diplomacy, where the scent of wax candles and perfume mingled with the sharper tang of geopolitical ambition. Here, amidst the gilded mirrors and velvet drapes, he wove a complex web of alliances, his cool rationality a bulwark against the volatile passions of the age. His goal was not justice, but equilibrium, a return to the ancient regime's orderly hierarchy, with Austria as its central pillar. The cast he manipulated was one of titanic egos and conflicting visions. Britain's Lord Castlereagh, aloof and pragmatic, viewed the continent with a dispassionate eye from his island fortress. His was a philosophy of balance. No single power, be it France or Russia, should ever again grow strong enough to dominate. He was the check, the calculator of power ratios, less interested in royal restoration than in creating a self-regulating system of states. Across the table, Tsar Alexander I of Russia presented a stark contrast. Mystical and expansionist, the victor over Napoleon saw himself as Europe's divine savior. His troops were massed in Poland, and his demand for a vast client kingdom there was the Congress's most dangerous fault line, a potential spark for new war. Then there was the fox among the lions, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, representing defeated France. Arriving with no official invitation, the cunning bishop-turned-diplomat exploited a single, brilliant principle: legitimacy. He argued that the Congress, to be legitimate, must include all historic powers, even the vanquished. By championing the rights of smaller states and appealing to the shared fear of revolution, he deftly inserted France from a position of pariah to that of a necessary partner in peace. His success was a masterclass in diplomatic jiu-jitsu, turning weakness into influence. Beneath the glittering surface, in hushed antechambers and private gardens, the real Congress worked. Maps were unfurled, borders traced and retraced with trembling fingers. The laughter from the ballroom was a constant, ironic soundtrack to the tense negotiations, a reminder that this grand gathering was a fragile vessel sailing on a deep and turbulent sea of unresolved ambitions and pervasive fear. The grand ballrooms of Vienna now gave way to the cluttered map rooms where the continent's fate was truly carved. Here, under the glow of oil lamps, Europe was dismantled and reassembled like a complex clockwork mechanism. The guiding principle was not the will of peoples, but the cold calculus of equilibrium. Monarchs, not democracies, were the essential gears. Stability, not liberty, was the paramount goal. The diplomats wielded their pens as sculptors' tools, molding the very shape of nations to craft a balance of power designed to prevent any single state from ever again aspiring to Napoleonic hegemony. France, the font of 2 decades of chaos, required careful handling. The victors were determined to contain her, but not to cripple her. A vengeful, humiliated France would only breed the resentment that fueled future wars. Thus, her borders were rolled back to those of 1790, stripping away Napoleon's conquests. A substantial war indemnity was imposed, and Allied armies would occupy her fortresses for years. Yet she remained intact major kingdom under the restored Bourbon Louis XVI. This measured punishment was a calculated investment in long-term peace, a lesson in restrained victory. To hem France in, a cordon of strengthened buffer states was constructed. The Austrian Netherlands were merged with the Dutch Republic to form a robust kingdom of the Netherlands in the north. To the east, the Swiss Confederation was declared perpetually neutral, a peaceful Alpine bastion. In the south, the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia was enlarged with the rich territory of Genoa, creating a sturdy Italian bulwark. Each was a strategic buffer, a shock absorber against future French ambition. The most intricate puzzle lay in Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, dissolved by Napoleon, would not be resurrected. In its place, Metternich engineered the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 sovereign states presided over by Austria. It was a masterpiece of political ambiguity, too weak to unite as a nationalist threat, but cohesive enough to provide a stable central bloc. This deliberately fragmented Germany satisfied Prussia's growing influence while ensuring Austrian primacy, keeping the region in a manageable equilibrium. Territorial compromises abounded, a mosaic of traded provinces and awarded duchies. Prussia gained rich lands in the Rhineland and part of Saxony, making her a guardian against France. Austria consolidated its influence by reclaiming Lombardy and Venetia in Italy. Russia's Tsar Alexander was appeased with most of Poland, created as a Congress kingdom under his personal rule, a concession that strained the alliance but averted immediate rupture. The final act was the establishment of the Concert of Europe, a solemn agreement for periodic diplomatic congresses to manage crises. It was a system designed for maintenance, not revolution, where the great powers, through continuous negotiation, would steward the peace they had so meticulously drawn. The meticulously drafted treaties in Vienna were still drying when news of an earthquake arrived from the Mediterranean. In March 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte had vanished from his exile on Elba. The impossible had happened. The eagle had escaped its island cage. Landing in southern France with a handful of men, he marched north, his legend outpacing reality. Regiments sent to arrest him instead melted into his ranks, their royalist oaths forgotten in the magnetic pull of his name. Within weeks, he was in Paris, Louis XVI having fled, the Bourbon Restoration crumbling like parchment in a flame. The 100 Days had begun. In Vienna, the shock was absolute. The elegant dance of diplomacy shattered into a frantic scramble for swords. The common enemy, thought forever neutered, had resurrected himself, exposing the Congress's peace as a still wet fresco. Yet the crisis became the ultimate test of the nascent diplomatic framework. The very powers that had been haggling over Saxon towns and Polish borders now united with astonishing speed. The quadruple alliance against Napoleon was instantly reaffirmed. Talleyrand, France's representative, shrewdly condemned his own emperor, ensuring the restored Bourbon cause remained part of the coalition. The Concert of Europe, conceived for peacetime management, proved its worth in wartime mobilization. Diplomacy had created the trust, however fragile, necessary for immediate military action. The renewed warfare was brief but cataclysmic. Napoleon, needing a decisive victory to split the converging Allied armies, drove north into Belgium. The coalition response was a testament to their coordination. The Prussian army under Gebhard von Blücher and an Anglo-Allied force commanded by the Duke of Wellington moved to intercept. The clash came on a rain-sodden plateau near Waterloo. On June 18, Napoleon launched assault after assault against Wellington's stubborn ridge, a brutal contest of infantry squares and cavalry charges. The outcome hung in the balance until the late afternoon, when Blücher's battered but relentless Prussians arrived on the French flank. This was the coalition made manifest, the diplomatic agreement on the battlefield. Napoleon's army, caught between two forces born of the Vienna Consensus, broke and fled. Waterloo was more than a military defeat, it was a political annihilation. Napoleon's final gamble had spectacularly failed, but in doing so it succeeded in cementing the very system he sought to destroy. The swift, unified response validated the Congress's core premise, that collective security could contain chaos. His second abdication sent him to a far more remote exile on St. Helena, but his dramatic return had forged the alliances of Vienna in fire. The event transformed theoretical treaties into a visceral, shared experience of peril and resolve. Diplomacy, tested by the ultimate crisis, had not only adapted but emerged stronger, its foundations solidified by the very threat it was designed to prevent. The dust of Waterloo settled, not into the quiet of exhaustion that had preceded Vienna, but into a profound and durable stillness. The Congress of Vienna's greatest achievement was not a treaty, but a timeline. For nearly 100 years, no major war engulfed the European continent. The system crafted in those gilded salons, for all its cold pragmatism, delivered an unprecedented era of stability. The map they had redrawn became the accepted reality, a geopolitical order maintained by the ongoing mechanism of the concert of Europe. Periodic congresses allowed the great powers to manage crises, from revolts in the Balkans to revolutions in 1848, through negotiation rather than mobilization, deftly adjusting the balance without overturning the board. This peace, however, was not synonymous with justice or progress. The Vienna settlement was a deliberate bulwark against the rising tides of nationalism and liberalism. The aspirations of the German, Italian, and Polish peoples were subordinated to the higher goal of equilibrium, their lands partitioned or placed under foreign crowns to serve as buffers or rewards. This suppression created a simmering pressure cooker of discontent, with revolutions periodically rattling its lid. Yet each time the concert acted to restore the established order, proving the system's resilience even as it highlighted its fundamental tension. Long-term stability often required the short-term denial of popular will. The legacy of Vienna was thus a complex tapestry of restraint and repression. It demonstrated that diplomacy, however imperfect, could be a formidable architect of order after catastrophic chaos. The balance of power doctrine, meticulously enforced, prevented any single nation from turning Europe into a self-regulating system of checked ambitions. For a century, the continent experienced not utopia, but a functional peace that allowed for economic expansion, industrial revolution, and cultural flourishing, all under the watchful eyes of conservative monarchies. Ultimately, the Congress's work endured until the very forces it had contained, nationalist fervor and great power rivalry, finally combusted in 1914. The system's collapse into the cataclysm of World War I would cast a long shadow over its achievements. Yet the century of peace stands as a testament to a singular moment when statesmen, having witnessed the abyss, chose to build an intricate, if flawed, machinery of restraint. They proved that order could be consciously engineered from the ruins of empire, a lesson in the sober, unsentimental art of preserving peace, where the greatest success was the long, quiet span of years between the thunderclaps of war.